We're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Joy Yamaguchi. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Japanese American National Museum. And I'm excited to have an audience both here in person and online on YouTube. Really excited to just be able to work with Heart Mountain on this program today. I have the fun task of doing a few logistical housekeeping notes for the folks who are here in person. We're just asking everyone that you keep your mask on at all times for the safety of everyone here today, and social distance as you are able. We did have to do a numbers cap on the RSVPs, and we're trying to keep our events small in person for everyone's safety. The restrooms are up on the second floor, accessible by the stairs or the elevator. You'll also see the exits illuminated by the emergency exit signs. So in case of emergency, please walk calmly out the doors and do not use the elevators. We also ask that there's no food or drink here in the auditorium. And after the program, we will be doing some book sales and signing out in the lobby, so please stick around for that. You can also check out our website, janm.org, for more information, and also please look to the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation for all the work they're doing as well. And with that, I'm going to introduce the president and CEO of JANM, Ann Burrows, to kick off the program for us tonight.
Thank you, Joy. Welcome, everybody. How good it is to see you, both to have our audience with us in person as well as our audience on the live stream. We're delighted to be partnering with Heart Mountain to bring this program to you. I wouldn't say that JANM has a more special relationship with Heart Mountain because, of course, we have a special relationship with all of the camps. But we do have a special relationship with Heart Mountain. We have many links, and there are many ways. Of course, it's not just the way we tell the story. It's not just the history of some of our volunteers, but there is also such a tight connection in terms of the artifacts that we have, and some of our most valuable artifacts, of course, are from Heart Mountain. When you visit the museum, you'll see that we have the barrack, Heart Mountain Barrack, and that really is one of the most stark and tangible artifacts that we have that tells the story not just of Heart Mountain, but tells the story of the incarceration. We also have another of our artifacts, which is also one of our most precious artifacts, and that is the journal and the letters of a young man called Stanley Hayami, who was imprisoned with his family at Heart Mountain, and he went on to serve with the 442nd in Europe, and he lost his life. And what, at the moment at JANM, we've recently opened an exhibition about his life, about his diaries, and it's extraordinary because he was this teenage man, teenage boy, really, he was a boy, and he animated this diary, and in it you see the aspirations of a teenager whose life was completely changed, and this teenager is asking these stories. But it's also very much a story about Heart Mountain. And one of the extraordinary things about Heart Mountain, and as with any of the other camps, is that it's the story of the place, it's the power of place, and it's how each camp, and Heart Mountain is no exception, how they're dedicated to preserving the stories, to preserving the sites, to preserving the history, and to preserving the artifacts. And I'm also very, very proud to be presenting this program because I'm not just the president and CEO of JANM, but I'm also a very proud member of Heart Mountain, of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation Board. So without saying much more, it's wonderful to have those of you who are with us tonight. It's wonderful to have those of you who are joining us online. And it's my distinct honor to welcome Dakota Russell, who's the Executive Director of Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. And I always feel as though, even although I'm on the board of Heart Mountain, I'm also, Dakota and I are both sort of the CEOs, executive directors, whatever, of our respective organizations. So, he and I sort of understand each other, I think, and sort of feel a level of each other's pain in ways that others may not. But he's inspiring, and I know that he'll kick off this program, and I know that for all of us tonight, this program will be moving and it'll be inspiring, and we'll hear all of those extraordinary stories of the people that have dedicated their lives to bringing Heart Mountain to life and to keeping these stories at the forefront of everyone's consciousness. So thank you so much, and Dakota, over to you.
First off, I do want to say thanks to Anne for publicly confirming that we are in a relationship. But really, I do want to give our greatest thanks to the Japanese American National Museum for hosting us tonight and for being such an amazing partner. I was able to visit the Stanley Hayami exhibit that Anne was talking about earlier today and was just incredibly moved by it. And it's wonderful to know that we have partners like the museum in helping tell the Heart Mountain story, you know, from our small little remote location in Wyoming to help to get the stories that are so important about the site out into the world. And of course, the Japanese American National Museum has been a big part of that. And so we're very appreciative of them. Before we bring on our main event and before we bring up Shirley Ann Higuchi and our other panelists, I wanted to open tonight with a short film that we put together to introduce some of the themes that appear in Shirley's book, Setsuko's Secret, and really follow her journey, because that's what's so special about this book, is that not only does it tell the history of Heart Mountain, but it actually follows Shirley's journey as she digs into her personal connection and her family connection to this story. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start with the film. Thank you.
I always knew that my parents met as children at a place called Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And my mother, Setsuko, always called it a place of love. It was only after she died, however, that I learned the truth. Heart Mountain was a prison. 14,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated there during World War II for the crime of looking like the enemy. Setsuko's Secret is my attempt to understand the lives of my family, myself, in the complicated history of the Japanese American experience. Both sets of my grandparents immigrated from Japan. The Higuchis came first, arriving in 1915 from Saga, on the southern island of Kyushu. They started farming in Santa Clara County, California. My mother's parents, the Saitos, came in 1918 and in 1923. They lived in San Francisco's Japantown and opened a store. Life in California was hard for Japanese Americans. State law banned immigrants from owning land, and Caucasian neighbors often resented their success. The children of immigrants called the Nisei had to work extra hard to prove they were loyal Americans. Despite hardships, many Japanese Americans found the good life and made their way in society. Some became professionals and owned their own home, and others excelled in college. But then came December 7th, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, wartime hysteria and racism intensified towards Japanese immigrants and Japanese American citizens. They called them spies or saboteurs, despite the lack of evidence. Then on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to ban Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Census records told the government where to find Japanese Americans. Signs posted in neighborhoods said they had just days to pack and leave. They could only bring what they could carry. My family was issued a duffel bag with their name and number stenciled on the outside. Shikata ganai, some said, the Japanese term for "it can't be helped." there was little resistance. They were first sent to assembly centers, which were temporary concentration camps on converted fairgrounds and racetracks. Some families slept in horse stalls and were forced to live like animals. This lasted a few months. Then the prisoners rode on a darkened train to one of the 10 concentration camps scattered across the U.S. My father remembers peering under the window shades to see where the train was going. My family was sent to Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. Many prisoners wept when they saw their new home surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Wind and dust swept through the tar paper walls. The barracks had no running water, the bathrooms had no privacy, and the mess hall food was terrible. Summers were sweltering and winters were brutal. The prisoners repeated another term, gaman, which means endure. In spite of this treatment, many incarcerees yearned to serve the country that imprisoned them. They enlisted in the army and fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific. But others stood up for their rights. More than 80 men at Heart Mountain resisted the military draft as long as they were prisoners. They were convicted and sent to federal prison. The rest of the Japanese American community shunned them for decades. My parents and grandparents spent 3 years behind barbed wire. After the war, they, along with many others in the community, wanted to put the shame and the rejection behind them. They never talked about it. My generation, called the Sansei, could not understand why. Only after my mother died did I realize the depth of her commitment to preserving the memory of the incarceration. She inspired me to understand this part of my family's history and my community's experience. Over the last decade, I've been committed to safeguarding against the racism and fear that drove the Japanese American incarceration. It was my mother, Setsuko, and her secret that taught me, and hopefully you, that we can never relax in the fight for justice.
So much for coming this evening, and thank you to the Japanese American National Museum and CEO Ann Burroughs. I'm really pleased to be here this evening with two distinguished panelists, Bacon Sakatani and Sam Mihara. And just to give a little bit of background, Bacon Anise was born and reared in El Monte, California, right, Bacon? And you attended a segregated grammar school for Mexican and Japanese pupils from 1st through 5th grades. Bacon was 13 years old when he was forcibly removed with his family to Heart Mountain. And believing that the lessons of the past will empower us to create a better tomorrow, Bacon, also known as Mr. Heart Mountain, has dedicated his entire life to accurately documenting and educating and learning about what happened to over 120,000 Japanese Americans over 79 years ago. I also have Sam Mihara here. As a child incarceree, he watched his grandfather die from cancer in camp and his father go blind at Heart Mountain. After the war, he went on to the University of California, Berkeley, became an engineer and rocket scientist for Boeing. And he too is a tireless educator, spreading the word about Heart Mountain and the incarceration. So this evening we're going to be talking about transformational stories with Heart Mountain. And in my situation, growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, my parents really didn't talk much about the incarceration. And the Nisei, known as a quiet American, apparently it was a very common thing. So my transformation really happened after my mother died, as you saw in the film. She passed away in 2005. It was my discovery of how much the site had actually meant to her. She whispered and she said, you know, I want my coat and my memorial money to go to Heart Mountain. And we were all looking at each other wondering, what's that? Why would she care so much about Heart Mountain? And I learned that just because somebody doesn't really talk about their experiences or their trauma or their pain doesn't mean that it matters to them. And that's what I really learned about my mother, you know, after she passed away. But for me, my big transformation really occurred when Dave Reese and Pat Wolf, who were the Wyoming leaders at the time, invited me to come and participate in the dedication of a walking tour in honor of my mother, and I almost didn't go. I mean, that's how little I knew about Heart Mountain in the site, that I almost felt like it was an imposition, or maybe somebody was taking advantage of us during a very terrible time that we had adjusting to my mother's death. But my transformation occurred when I walked on that site and I saw all the Nisei, as well as Secretary Norman Minetta and Senator Simpson and others, not only honoring my mother, but honoring what happened to all Japanese Americans during that time. So, you know, I just wanted to say that this story tonight is about transformation, and I'm really convinced, and I talked to you earlier about this, Bacon, that I felt that your transformation happened when you read Doug Nelson's book, and you learn more about what really happened there. And I wonder if you could talk about it, and Doug will be joining us shortly along with Dakota Russell to talk about his experiences at Heart Mountain as well. But can you tell us a little bit about when you really learned what really happened there and what you were experiencing?
Well, it was my job to tell the history of the camp at this first Heart Mountain reunion. And I didn't know anything about the camp except I was there and I had a lot of fun. And so a friend found this book by Douglas Nelson, you know, Heart Mountain, the history of an American concentration camp. And I read that and I just couldn't believe, you know, what had happened there at the camp. You know, we went to the camp, we obeyed the orders, you know, we were told what to do, and, you know, we were told why we were there, and...
I'm going to turn your microphone on. Hold on. Just so we can hear you better. Hold on. There we go.
And, you know, I didn't know anything about the camp. And so when I read that book, boy, it really amazed me. And it made me angry. And so from that point on, you know, I had to learn more and more about what happened. You know, I went to the University of Wyoming 5-6 times to read all the newspapers and all the government papers. I went to the University of California Bancroft Library. You know, I found all the original papers there. A friend of mine got stuff from the National Archive. And boy, was I really amazed as to what happened to us. You know, we just obeyed. You know, we did what the government told us to do as loyal Americans. You know, that was our job, to be in the camp and comply. And so from that point on, I just began my study, and I really learned what happened at the camp.
Okay, well, thanks so much for that, Bacon. And tell us, I mean, I talk about it in the book, but tell us how you got your nickname, Bacon. And after you were named Bacon, how did you go on to be known as Mr. Heart Mountain? Because a lot of registrants ask this question.
Well, before the war, across the street lived this Portuguese immigrant. And my brother and their friends went over there to see what was happening. And they had a big hole dug, and they had a, charcoal fire going, and they had a whole pig that they were barbecuing. And so my brother and their friends, they watched that. And so they came back home to the house where I was at, and they started to build a bonfire. And then they strung me over the fire as if, I was the pork and they were trying to barbecue me. And so, just like a piece of bacon. And so that's how I got my nickname.
Oh, geez. Well, I hope you weren't hurt at all. But, okay, well, maybe you have a better story about why they call you Mr. Heart Mountain. Not as violent, I hope.
Well, let's see now. We started to have our camp reunions. And computers first came out, the home computers, in the 80s. And so I was a computer software programmer. And so I was able to program or, make software to register people for the reunion. No one could do that. And so I was able to do that and make name tags, make all the registration lists. And I became a valuable person. And so all the rest of the reunions, I was able to do that on the computer and other things on the computer. And so I became known for, doing that and all the history stuff that I was giving. And as a joke, at one of the reunions, someone suggested that I be given the name Mr. Heart Mountain. And, as a joke, it started and it just stuck.
Well, that's great. Well, I think it's a nice title given your dedication. So we have a really strong connection with the Japanese American National Museum, and I heard that you were instrumental in bringing that barrack from Wyoming. Can you talk about that connection and how that came about?
Okay, when the museum first started, they were on 3rd Street, just one little room. And I met this woman who was the sole employee of the museum. And I knew her from before. And so she said, "Oh, come on into my office and see what we got going with this new museum." And inside the room was this huge drawing of a barrack. That was going to be the centerpiece of the exhibit for this new museum. And so I told this woman, "Hey, Nancy, I know where there's a barrack." And so from that point on, we formed a committee that we're going to go after this Heart Mountain barrack and bring it to this new museum.
Okay, well, I love that story. And another connection with the Japanese American National Museum was your friendship and history with Estelle Ishigo. And as you know, we were involved in saving that artwork, which we now are displaying at Heart Mountain. But can you explain, do you remember Estelle when you were in camp? I mean, do you remember seeing her? And then what was it like discovering her so many years later with all, I guess she was in a dilapidated setting and she had lost her legs to gangrene. And just tell us about when you first met her or when you first saw her and then how you stayed connected.
Wow, when we were first sent to the Pomona Assembly Center, I saw this good-looking white woman. And I was wondering, why is she there? And then I found out, she was married to a Japanese person. And boy, I think she was in her early 40s, but she was a good-looking woman. And then later on at Heart Mountain, I used to see her around. Well, let's see, it was in about 1984, on my first visit to Heart Mountain, I met this official from Montana. So after my trip, he contacted me, and he wanted me to find this Estelle Ishigo, because they wanted to use one of her drawing on a plaque at Heart Mountain. So I looked around Los Angeles, and I found her. Oh, she was in this broken down basement apartment. She was in a wheelchair. Both of her legs were amputated. Oh, her bed, her mattress, her sheets on the bed, oh, they were dirty like they'd never been washed. Oh, she had cans and cans of Campbell's soup. She had an electric hot plate, and that's how she was, surviving. Oh, it was really a terrible shape, But I got to know her, and I got the drawing off of her to be used at this Heart Mountain site. And I just had to help her out. She was penniless. Both of her, legs amputated. Oh, and she had a book that was previously published, Lone Heart Mountain. And so she said, oh, we gotta get this book published. We gotta tell the whole world, what we went through. And so, this was the beginning of my friendship with her, that lasted for the next 6 years before she died.
Yes, and I talk about this in the book, how you scattered her ashes on Heart Mountain, which I thought was really important.
Yeah. Well, many people think, she was a very nice woman. But the truth was that, when she was a kid, she ran away from home, she was running around Los Angeles, here on Main Street, she was running around with this Portuguese gal. And she was telling me, she was a street gal. And that's the way she was. But I helped her out, and I knew, she needed help. And then finally, she was getting old, and, we had to do something about her. And, the way she talked, I said to her, you want me to dump your ashes on top of Heart Mountain? And she said, yes. And then a few years later, I climbed to the top of Heart Mountain, and I dumped her ashes on top of Heart Mountain.
Yes, and I remember seeing that photo, and it's a really important time that was occurring. But let me turn to Sam for a minute, and I think that in a lot of ways Estelle, has a very tragic story. I mean, I think that's an example of somebody who didn't do well after the war. But I wanted to get some insights from Sam. So can you tell us about what was going on when you were forced from your home in 1942, and how that experience was, and what was it like in the camp?
Sure, and thank you, Shirley, for inviting me to talk a little about my history. Let me go back quickly to the Miharas, where they came from, and that was in western Japan, a town called Matsuyama, which is in Ehime Prefecture on Shikoku Island, the four-sided island, across the sea from Hiroshima. And Grandpa and Grandma were common workers. They had no special skills. Grandpa knew how to make miso, the soybean paste. And Grandma used to work in a fabric company, a textile company, operating a weaving machine. And they knew that in order to break out of that class that they were in, they had to get their son, my father, a good education. That was their hope for the family, is to get my father a good education. And they did. They worked hard. And Dad went to a place called Waseda University. It's probably the #1 university in Japan. And he majored in English. And therefore, he found a job in San Francisco working for a newspaper, bilingual newspaper. He started writing articles and writing books, and eventually he became a very successful editor of the English section of the paper. So we did very well. We were in a nice, comfortable house until December the 7th. And on that fateful day, we could just see the problems starting to build up, the hatred starting to build up, especially in San Francisco, billboards demanding that we leave, and it was really bad. So we followed the orders by General DeWitt, and he said to show up at a certain place, board the buses, take us to our first camp, which in our case was Pomona. Then we went to Heart Mountain, got on a train, on that horrible prison train for 3 days and nights until we stopped at this place called Heart Mountain. And I can clearly remember getting off the train, carrying our handbag, getting on the back of Army trucks, stuffed like cattle, going through the main gate and going to our Block 14 in the barracks. And I'll never forget, the first day I went into that barrack, it's like walking into a storage shed. On the inside, it was absolutely no inner walls, no insulation. All you saw was the inside surface of the outside walls. And there were 4 cots for 4 of us in our family. And no water, no electricity. It was really it was a cell. It was a prison cell. And we had to go outside for everything, to go to the toilets, awful toilets, 10 toilet bowls without seats, and no partitions. And when it came time to go do your business, there were 9 faces looking at you. That was not easy. The food, as we heard on the film, was awful. I can remember we had the bread and potatoes. We had pickled vegetables and powdered milk. I've sworn off powdered milk for the last 80 years. It was bad. And so life was really difficult. But then the worst came when my father, he had a mild case of glaucoma of his eyes before the war. In fact, he started developing it out of college in Japan. But in San Francisco, he was under the care of a really good ophthalmologist surgeon, and was able to maintain his eyesight. That is, until he came to Heart Mountain. And we found out the Heart Mountain, the medical staff was primarily general practitioners, and there were no specialists. And so my father asked for some help, and General DeWitt would not let him go back to see his specialist. As a result, he became blind in camp, never saw again, and that made life really difficult for our family. But that wasn't the worst case. The worst was my grandpa. He developed a case of colon cancer in camp. Yeah. And I watched him. His body withered away to skin and bones within a matter of about 3 months. He looked like a Holocaust survivor. And I wondered for a long time, and he passed away. We had a funeral inside a barrack, and it was embarrassing. And I wondered for a long time, what really happened? So I got a hold of his medical records at the National Archives. I couldn't believe my eyes. And the doctors were treating him with a special diet, which is no food. They were not giving him any intravenous feeding. In fact, they were giving him a laxative for cancer. I said, oh my gosh. So that's the kind of a treatment that we received. And so that was the conditions that I remember from the camp. But really the worst experience I remember, the very worst, was going into Cody. On occasion, we would go in with a few people at a time, and going to downtown Cody and seeing these signs about every 3rd store that said no in the J word. It was awful, and I'll never forget that. And so my memories of Heart Mountain were really bad, and for a long time, I refused to step foot in Wyoming, much less Heart Mountain, until a little bit later on in my life.
Right, and when we talk about transformational stories, we mentioned Bacon's reading Doug Nelson's book, but I believe your transformation occurred when you came to our grand opening in 2011, because I know that you came to my office, and this is all in the book, and showed up in Washington, D.C. and said you wanted to get involved. And I think one of the best decisions I ever made was putting you on the board, because you're the hardest working board member that we have. So can you talk about what your experience was at the grand opening and what sort of transformed your thinking about Heart Mountain and Wyoming?
Sure. I really had no special interest in supporting Heart Mountain. It was a place of bad memories for me. But after the grand opening of the Learning Center, I received a call from Christy Fleming, the executive director at the time, and Christy said, "Sam, we have a request from a lawyers' conference in Cheyenne, and they'd like to have a person who was at the camp talk about what happened." And I said, "Well, I don't know, Cheyenne, travel expenses, you're all covered. They'll pay for everything." I said, "Oh, all right, I'm your man." And so I went to Cheyenne. I walked in the federal building, the conference room, about 100 attorneys. And my first question, just to gauge the audience, how many of you have heard the name Fred Korematsu? 3 people raised their hand out of 100 lawyers. I couldn't believe it. And my second question, how many of you have heard of the name Mitsuwa Endo? No one. So I thought to myself, this is easy. These people know almost nothing. So I went on with my discussion, and I found out after it was over, the lead U.S. attorney for the conference, he got on the computer and got a message to all U.S. attorneys in the country saying, "You got to hear Sam. This is an amazing story." So I got appointments to go to speak at Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco, all the U.S. attorneys' offices, and they all loved it. And so that kind of started me interested in teaching. I really get a lot of enjoyment out of teaching people something they didn't know, which is an extremely important part of our history. And so that's how I began my career in speaking, and I thoroughly enjoy what I'm doing.
Well, thanks so much for everything you do, Sam. It's really amazing. And what's really interesting about, we always say this thing about 6 degrees of Heart Mountain. We're all touched in some ways. And what's really interesting is when Sam came to my office in Washington, D.C., he didn't know that Setsuko was my mother. You didn't know, because Saito, that's not my last name, it's Higuchi. So this whole time when we're interacting, I found out later that they knew, your families knew my mother's family before, during, and after the war. And it's so interesting for me to be able to learn more about my mother after she passed. So I thank you for that. And with Bacon, my mother actually worked with him on the 2002 Salt Lake City reunion, right? Very successful?
Yes. Well, I went to the first meeting to help them out, to show them how we do the reunion. And so I went to the meeting, and I knew the chairman, Raymond Uno, and then I met some woman there named Seth. And after I told, what they should do for the reunion, I went home, and then I got a call. This woman said, she was Seth. She asked me if I was Bacon. I said, yes. And then from then on, I couldn't say a word. She kept talking and talking and talking, so that finally, when the phone call ended, I was the MC, I was the chief photographer, and I was to make the reunion booklet. And that was my meeting with this woman, your mother.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess that's where I got all my energy from, maybe from my mom. But you know what? I'd like to bring Doug Nelson and Dakota Russell up here now. And with Doug's background, his history with Heart Mountain has been a journey and a transformation, I think, throughout his whole life. And it started with him arriving as a graduate student in 1968 at the University of Wyoming. And since that time, Doug has immersed himself in the history, and as you heard, he was very instrumental in educating Bacon about what really happened at the camp, and he studied the history and told that story of the Heart Mountain resistors that we saw in the film. And he's been president and CEO of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and he's one of the nation's influential leaders and works with the CDC Foundation and the Carter Center. He's also director of the Minetta Simpson Institute, which he's going to talk about in a bit. And Dakota Russell, who you met earlier, was a leader in the Missouri State Parks and Museums system before coming to Heart Mountain, and he's upgraded and professionalized our staff, and he's won major federal and private grants, and he's leading the fundraising for Minetta Simpson Institute. So welcome to Doug and Bacon. And Doug, I want to ask you, in chapter 13 of my book, I talk about how your initial exposure to Heart Mountain and what was going on at that time. What really made you decide to write about Heart Mountain? What inspired you?
Well, it happens that in 1968, I got an offer from the University of Wyoming when I was graduating from undergraduate school, to come and teach the survey course in American history. And I didn't know anything about Wyoming, but I was so flattered by this opportunity, I said, well, I'm going to go do that. And when I got to the university, of course, I wanted to get a graduate degree. I was very interested in African American history, and there was almost no resources around that subject at the history department at the time. But there was a professor there who was interested in Japanese American history in the country, Roger Daniels, and he suggested that I look into the camp that was the relocation center that was located at Heart Mountain. And I remember this conversation. I said, well, somebody must have written books about all of these camps. I knew in general what had happened, about that much. And he said, I don't think so. And in fact, there was not more than a paragraph. This is 1970, 25 years after that camp closed. There was not more than a paragraph in a general history of the state of Wyoming that described what had happened in what, during the war, was the third largest city in the state. And the first thing I did was my wife and I drove up to the site of the Heart Mountain between Cody and Powell, about 250 miles from Laramie, where the university is. And I drove to where they told me the site was, and I was amazed that there was nothing there. There was a chimney, which subsequently I learned belonged to the boiler at the hospital. Otherwise, it was an immense hayfield that stood there without a single reminder of what had happened to 14,000 people there. My first reaction was, well, maybe this whole thing isn't that important. How can it be that there isn't a marker or a sign? But I went back and spent the next year and a half learning as much as a person could at that time about what happened at Heart Mountain. And in many ways, it changed my life. And the thing that I remember most was that this story of Heart Mountain, and to some extent all the other camps, is an extraordinary story. It is as concrete an illustration of the terrible tragedy of unchecked racism in an environment of fear. But it was more than that. It was also a story of resilience, the remarkable adaptation, the effort of Issei parents to create an environment and the Nisei leaders in that that was as normalized as they could make it, as American as they could make it, as hospitable as you could make a concentration camp. And the accomplishments that occurred there were extraordinary. So the resilience was immense, and the redemption part of this story, the ability of the Japanese American community to survive this trauma and go on to make immense contributions to the country. That was a story that changed my life, and particularly, I learned something as a 20-year-old in writing that really made me who I am, and that was the story of the resistors and the story of those who volunteered and served in the 442nd. These two opposite responses to the circumstances that young men found themselves in at Heart Mountain, I concluded after wrestling with this aspect of life there, that here two opposite positions were taken by Americans, and they were both right. They were both right. And the complexity of patriotism and the responsibilities of American citizens really, I grew up with that understanding, and fortunately, years later, people familiar with the book got a hold of me and asked me if I could help create some kind of museum there, and it seemed like I was coming full circle, because that was the strongest feeling. There ought to be something there to remind people and to honor people and to learn from. So that was an opportunity I jumped at, and it's been one of the central themes of my life tonight.
Well, we've appreciated, Doug, everything that you've done for Heart Mountain and for the Niseis, not only educating the Niseis, but also in many ways helping the community find a voice in terms of promoting what's going on at Heart Mountain. And after the accomplishment of opening this beautiful museum in 2011, you're embarking on another venture, the Minetta Simpson Institute, and I was hoping that you could talk to us a little bit about that. And I know we have a slide on the Minetta Simpson Institute that we're going to pull up, but why don't you tell us a little bit about why it's important and how we got to the point of honoring these two great men?
Yeah, the Minetta Simpson Institute is by no means my vision. It is really the collective vision of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation board. We are proud of what has been created there. We're proud of the interpretive center. We're proud of the work that's being done to restore the site. And we're proud of the fact that by now well over 100,000 people have come to Heart Mountain and to visit the historic site and the museum. But this is a story that deserves an audience far larger, and the lessons of this story needs to be told to a far larger audience than those who can actually and will actually come to that site and experience in person the museum. And so we collectively have decided that we need to amplify and we need to create access to this story, to the meaning of this story, to the lessons of what happened at Heart Mountain to a far larger audience. And we began to think about trying to create a center there that first of all could produce resources, documentaries, oral histories, live streaming of events at the camp, ways of making it accessible to people all over the country in one form or another. And that is the sort of soul of the vision of the Minetta Simpson Institute as a conference center. And we've already begun to multiply our influence, or at least the influence of the story. The NEH has supported teacher training at the Heart Mountain site, and we'll do it again. We had 72 teachers from around the country going back to their classes with a curriculum to teach hundreds, each of them, of young people about the Heart Mountain story, about the incarceration story. So in some ways, this is a way of making this story accessible to many, many more people, and in as rich and in as honest a way as we possibly can. But also, the Minetta Simpson Institute isn't just creating accessibility for lots of people. We also want to make the Heart Mountain story understandable and important to Americans regardless of their politics, regardless of their race, regardless of their economic standing in the country. We want this to be the property of Republicans and Democrats, of conservatives and liberals, of Americans, really, of all backgrounds. And in trying to package the story in a way that achieves that goal, we had no better example than Norman Minetta and Alan Simpson, who met at the camp and who spent a lifetime sharing a common commitment to American values and American principles and to the Constitution and to human rights and to civil rights, despite the fact that on so many other issues they were on different sides of the aisle. They not only found common ground around this story, but they also found a remarkable and enduring friendship. They themselves have been the kind of inspirational backdrop of all that the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation has been able to do, and we're convinced that they deserve the recognition, and that's why we call this soon-to-be conference center, research center, the Minetta Simpson Institute. We think both men's public service deserves that kind of recognition, and we think their relationship is a model of the kind of community and unity the country badly needs now.
Thanks, Doug. Well, I'm going to turn to Dakota Russa now, who's doing a fabulous job as our executive director. He's juggling a lot of different projects. But why don't you talk first about the restoration of the root cellar as one of our premier projects that we're working on. And then if you could talk a bit about the Minetta Simpson Institute and the actual design and what it's replicating in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really fitting that the theme of tonight's event is transformation, because Doug touched on it even a little bit beyond the stories that we heard from Shirley, Sam, and Bacon on, the ways that we as an organization, as a historic site, as a museum have sort of transformed in our short time that we've been here. Because we've always thought of ourselves as a museum that just doesn't just look backwards, that we look forwards as well, that we want to use history in a way that informs the decisions that people make in the future. And that's a piece of what we are doing with the site in Wyoming, where we're not just expanding the interpretive center and the programming that we do, but we're also bringing new features to the site in the form of the original Heart Mountain barrack that we're restoring, the root cellar, which of course you mentioned is a major undertaking that we're working on right now. That's a 300-foot underground structure with an earthen roof on top. It is the only surviving building that was actually designed and built by the Japanese American Incarcerees themselves. And it's really incredibly special because it is built to the point that they actually went and took over a sawmill in the nearby Shoshone National Forest and actually harvested the timbers themselves. So you go down there and you can still see the tool marks of the hand tools on the timbers. And it's just this amazingly evocative place. But Central also do the story that it tells about food within the camp that Shirley touched on just a bit there, and the need to survive as a community, to demonstrate that sort of resilience, that would get them through the camp years there. And I think it's going to be a powerful artifact that can speak to that once we're finished with that project. But we sort of are incorporating sort of those elements of food, of survival, into the design of this Minetta Simpson Institute as well. Now, those of you who have seen our museum before, you'll note that it is designed to look like 3 Heart Mountain barracks sitting together there. And so as we approached this idea of a place where people could come together, a place where people could exchange ideas, we thought about it and decided that another barrack just wouldn't do for that purpose, right? And we wanted something from the camp that evoked that idea. And the mess halls are, of course, a place of sustenance within the camp itself. You know, a place that, as we had mentioned, was at first a place where you could get some very bad meals, as Sam mentioned with the powdered milk. But eventually, as the agriculture program was more and more a success, eventually as the incarcerees at Heart Mountain started growing their own food and providing their own food for the mess hall tables and getting the traditional Japanese American diet represented better within Heart Mountain, they became places where community could be built. And they also served as the places where on Saturday nights you might go and find a bunch of incarcerees who had been musicians or performers back here in Los Angeles performing in talent shows in the mess halls. These were the places where the Fair Play Committee, the draft resistance movement that Doug spoke about, would set up their meetings, and where Kiyoshi Okamoto would get up and give his charismatic speeches that brought people over to this cause. And so they were really a place where people convened, where they talked with one another, where they engaged with one another, where in this extremely harsh and brutal place, a sense of community was built. And that's what we decided we wanted to evoke in the architecture of the Minetta Simpson Institute at Heart Mountain. And really, again, trying to tie together that synthesis of past, present, and future.
That's great. Thanks for that explanation. Well, we have a couple of questions that came in. One is from Iris Yamashita, who I know is a screenwriter in LA. And this is a question for Bacon and Sam. She's interested in knowing that since you guys both came from diverse neighborhoods, San Francisco and LA, what were the interactions with other minorities like African American and Hispanics? And how was that relationship pre-war versus post-war? So I'll ask Sam first, and Bacon, you can go second. So Sam, what was that like?
Well, in San Francisco, I lived in Japantown, which during World War II, what happened was as the Japanese families were removed, many of the minority workers came to San Francisco to work in the defense industry, and they lived in our homes. And so Japantown turned out to be a really multicultural, highly diverse organization. In fact, it was that way before the war. We have photographs of children in classes at the grammar school, and the kids are very, very diversified. And so you know, frankly, I don't remember any problems at all. We just got along quite well, and I don't understand, you know, the nature of today's problems where there's such a friction between races, because you know, the conditions that we had in San Francisco, it wasn't that at all. It was quite pleasant, and so we had no racial problems in school. Even going through middle school and high school, I don't remember any particular problems in that area.
Okay, well, how about you, Bacon? What was the experience with the other minorities before the war and after the war, besides turning into a piece of bacon by one?
Well, before the war, when I lived in the town of El Monte, well, this is where, you know, we had the segregated schools, segregated theaters, swimming pools, restaurants. But then we moved to another farming area, and there it was quite different. You know, the farmers were Italian immigrants or from France. And so we got along fairly well. At the school, I guess there was about 25 percent to 30% Japanese at my school. And one of my classes, we had a Japanese day. You know, the Japanese students brought Japanese items to the class and explained Japanese culture to the class. And so, you know, we all got along pretty well. We had a six-man football team, and the three-star players were Japanese Americans. And so, you know, at one time, we had segregated school at this one town. And then at the next town that I went to, we all got along fine.
Well, that's great. Actually, maybe one last quick question. We have to wrap it up. If you guys could quickly talk about the Boy Scouts and the civic clubs that were occurring in Wyoming when you were in camp. What was that like?
Oh, the Boy Scout program. When we first got to Heart Mountain, the Boy Scouts got very active. You know, they started to form Boy Scout troops all over the camp. You know, we didn't have to ask, you know, can we have a Boy Scout troop? They came to us, you know, the Boy Scout leaders. You know, they came to us and said, okay, you guys, we're going to form a Boy Scout troop. And so we got a troop going. You know, we went camping. The first camping trip was just outside the fence. You know, they put up a big tent, and that was our camping trip. And then on another trip, you know, we Boy Scouts by ourselves, we went to the river, you know, and we had our own tent, and we got our little group going. And then there was a watermelon patch next to our campground. And so, you know, no one knew how to pick a watermelon. And so someone had a knife. And so we plugged a few. And we, I guess we finally found a ripe one. But then a bulletin came out and said, vandals got into the watermelon patch and destroyed the watermelon crop. But one of the good things about the Boy Scout, you see, the camp director wanted to use the Boy Scout. You know, he wanted the youngsters of the camp to get off the influence of the Issei, or, you know, our immigrant parents, you know, what they were teaching us. And so the camp director wanted to give an American way of life to the Boy Scouts. And so he contacted Yellowstone National Park, you know, which was close by. And so he got 500 Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts to spend 1 week at Yellowstone. Oh, that was the greatest adventure that I had at Heart Mountain.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I think we've just run out of time. I'm getting the signal, so I'd like to thank Bacon and Sam, Doug and Dakota for joining me this evening, and thank you again to Janum. Good night, everyone. Good night. I guess we're off.